So welcome to this Institute of Modern Languages research seminar. And today we have got Zach Eastop talking on Rabelais' radical farce reconsidered. What did Dindenault do to deserve this? I'll introduce Zach shortly, just to begin with a couple of practicalities. So after his presentation, which will be around 20 to 25 minutes, there'll be time for discussion and questions. So you can post questions in the chat. We'd also like you to kind of maybe interact. So if in the discussion part, do feel free to, raise your hand or let me know if you'd like to ask a question, and kind of there will be time to kind of unmute yourself and respond to Zach's presentation with questions or comments. So I think that is everything. As I say, do, if you can, make sure you're muted during Zach's presentation. That would be very much appreciated. And I will move on now to introduce Zach. So Zach is currently writing his MRes thesis with us here at the IMLR on the works of François, Rabelais and their long 19th century musico-theatrical adaptations. And this builds on Zach's longer term interest in music and theatrical adaptations, and he's previously published in the journal German Life and Letters on Verdi's adaptation of Schiller's Don Carlos. I think I'm doing lots of weird pronunciations, combining French and German and all sorts here. So I'm also really delighted to confirm that Zach is going to be starting an AHRC funded PhD in Durham in French studies in the autumn, which will build on his current project. But I will hand over to Zach now to start sharing his screen and to begin his presentation, which will be on Rabelais' radical farce reconsidered. What did Dindenault do to deserve this? Thanks.
Yeah, hi everyone. Thanks for coming. I suppose the best thing about this master's is the safe space it's given me to play with ideas. I'm not yet a doctor, nor actually yet a doctoral candidate. That's happening next year. And so the pressure's off a little. While I'm writing this thesis, I've had to make my figurative bed. In fact, to be honest, I've made a pretty large one here, I think. I don't actually have to lie in it just yet. In this space, I've been able to take several key themes and concepts in Rabelais studies, give them a good old prod, and boldly say what I think I can see, free from the threat of peer reviews, Viva panels, or actually any sort of research output quota whatsoever, except, of course, my word count. This is, for now, what I think I can see. Maybe in a few years, I'll see something else. Maybe I'll find more evidence and double down. Who knows? But for now, I think it's worth throwing at a wall like a nearly ready piece of spaghetti and seeing if it sticks. And yeah, I'm very grateful to the IMLR for giving me such a fabulous wall to throw it at. So I'm aware that some people on the call won't be Rabelais scholars or even have read much Rabelais, so I'm going to start with story time. In chapters 5 to 8 of the Livre, this is Rabelais' 4th book, Pantagruel and his entourage meet a group of traveling merchants who are sailing back home to Saint-Ouen in northwestern France from Lanternland. Panurge gets into an argument with a shepherd called Dindenault, who calls him, still unmarried at this point, a cuckold. The conflict escalates until everyone draws their blades. Luckily, the helmsman intervenes, diffuses the situation, and the pair shake hands in perfect reconciliation. Panurge then turns to Epistemon and Frère Jean, who are 2 other members of Pantagruel's entourage, secretly telling them to stand back and enjoy the beau jeu, or good bit of theatre. He then approaches Dindenault and asks to buy one of his sheep. Dindenault refuses. Panurge asks over and over again, but is refused every time. First, because he does not look like a shepherd, then because the sheep are too valuable. Dindenault ridicules Panurge, calling him Robin Mouton and making sheep noises. Panurge replies calmly, reminding himself to be patient while repeatedly asking to buy a sheep. Eventually, after another intervention by the helmsman, Dindenault capitulates and sells Panurge a sheep for 3 livres tournois, about 6 times the normal price. After selecting and paying for the most resplendent of Dindenault's flock, Panurge tosses it into the sea. Hearing its desperate drowning bleats, the other sheep begin hurling themselves overboard too, and panicking, Dindenault grabs hold of a ram, but alas, the animal is just too strong and drags the shepherd over into the water with him. Panurge then picks up an oar, and while holding Dindenault underwater with it, recites rhetorical commonplaces. So, generally speaking, approaches to this episode fall into one of two camps, the economic and the theatrical. On the economic side of things, Terence Cave has argued that through Panurge, Rabelais is able to explore early modern economic behaviors and practices. Early modern economic behaviors and practices, as well as notions of value and currency. Philippe Dessin continues this in his exploration of the early modern economic imaginary. This is a sort of shared economic consciousness which permeates the writing of Rabelais and his contemporaries. For Dessin, the scene parodies and subverts the sorts of mercantile exchange which had taken hold of the Lyonnais marketplace over Rabelais' lifetime. More recently, last year I think, Catherine Ibbott had argued that the sheep, the pastoral image par excellence, appears in the scene as a symbol of agricultural and thus economic expansion into the New World, reflecting the era's increasingly globalized networks of trade. The scene is quite overtly economic. It's very hard to argue otherwise. Not only does Dindenault literally call his sheep money, he calls them moutons à la grande laine, which was at the time Rabelais was writing, it was also the name of the coin. But he and Panurge are engaged in commerce, albeit of a very strange variety. Panurge is trying to buy a sheep, and Dindenault does eventually sell him one, though for a hugely inflated price. The other approach is that of the thespians, who argue the scene is a piece of theatre, one structurally and thematically similar to late medieval farce. Christian de Loins-Louet has demonstrated how Panurge constructs a theatrical space of impunity in which he can exact revenge on the shepherd for insulting him in a production at once comic and tragic. Bernadette Reyflot has drawn clear parallels between the Dindenault scene and the farce de Maître Pierre Patelin, whose intrigue, at least in its second half, also revolves around a naughty shepherd, this time called Thibault Langlet, who also makes silly sheep noises. Like the economic arguments, the theatricality of the scene is really hard to deny. It takes place on the deck of a ship, a raised platform which, like the world of the theatrical stage, is enclosed and insular, not surrounded by seats, but surrounded by open water. Panurge describes his revenge as a beau jeu, a nice piece of theatre for which there is an audience. At one point, the dialogue even breaks down into a script format. The association with farce in particular is also quite hard to deny. There are numerous references in the scene to well-known farces, not just Patelin, but also a farce called Robin Mouton, which is the name that Dindenault gives Panurge. It's also the name of a main character from a farce called Robin Mouton. While this farcical theme has been explored by several critics, it is Bruce Hayes who takes this critical approach the furthest, arguing that throughout all of Rabelais' texts, farce, quote, serves as both a structuring mechanism and a rhetorical weapon for social, religious, and political satire, end quote. Hayes argues that farce is essentially a conservative genre, which Rabelais co-opts and repurposes, rendering it a tool for satirically undermining hegemonic power structures. For Hayes, Rabelais takes a genre, quote, characterized by its fundamental conservatism that seeks to maintain the status quo, end quote, and radically alters it, vastly expanding its subversive potential. In short, for Hayes, Rabelais' texts and the Dindenault scene make conservative farce no longer conservative. It is, quote, radically transformed, end quote. Now, I agree with Hayes. Rabelais' farce is radically transformed. That much is true. But I claim this transformation does not liberate the genre from its overarching conservative ethos, imbuing it with a subversiveness it would have otherwise lacked. No, instead, as I will demonstrate using the Dindenault episodes as my example, this transformation operates in more or less the exact opposite direction to the one outlined by Hayes. In Rabelais' hands, what was a deeply subversive genre paradigm is instead rendered radically conservative. But hey, we're getting ahead of ourselves, aren't we, a little? What do I actually mean when I talk about a farce or a farce-like structure? I should probably clarify that. Well, structurally, farces are pretty straightforward. You have a common character, a baker, a cobbler, a farmhand, a shepherd, who transgresses a societal norm of some kind, overstepping some social or behavioral boundary. This transgression is known as démesure, or excess. Characters guilty of démesure are, according to the norms of farce, then punished in what is known as the volte-face. This is a humiliating reversal towards the end of the play, in which the character who has overstepped social bounds is brought crashing back down, most often in a violent or humiliating way, and also quite often one achieved by cunning trickery. Now, when taken at face value, this does seem pretty conservative. Someone of a low socio-economic status is first allowed to transgress and then violently put in their rightful place in the social order. We must remember, however, that farce is a theatrical genre. Theatrical genres are performed. And performances have audiences who, regardless of their socio-economic or socio-cultural identity, always possess at least some level of interpretive power. It is this which ultimately decides the genre's ethos. In his recent study, Pure Filth, Noah D. Gunn argues that the treatment of the farcical genre paradigm in critical discourse since the 17th century has privileged the voices of the humanist intelligentsia, denying, quote, to the supposedly benighted hoi polloi the capacity to imagine alternative social realities or oppose existing ones, end quote. While the farce audience was drawn from all social ranks and milieus, actually only those near the top of the socioeconomic hierarchy would have the means to record, print, and promulgate these plays, effectively constituting a layer of censorship by the ruling and intellectual classes. Further, when tracing the influence of farce on other forms of cultural artifact, like Rabelais' texts, for example, one is unavoidably influenced by discourses of wealth and power. Writing presupposes literacy, which in this period generally presupposed some level of wealth. And then what survives does so because of its acceptance by those who control both the means of intellectual reproduction and what goes into archives, the humanist intelligentsia to which Rabelais certainly belonged. Theatrical texts, like those of farce, are also written foreseeing an eventual performance. They contain a potential to be performed, a space to be filled at the point of performance. As Valère Novarina puts it, the script, quote, est toujours un texte à venir. It's always a text to come. By claiming that, quote, dans le texte, le manque est inscrit, in the text, a lack is inscribed, and that, quote, le texte de théâtre s'écrit avec beaucoup de vide autour. The text is written with lots of emptiness around it. Novarina emphasizes the unfinishedness of a theatrical text, the room left for performance. Conversely, therefore, the restriction of a performance genre to text constitutes its hollowing out. Layers of symbolic meaning contained in the non-verbal aspects of the performance are removed, leaving little to no room for the subversive nuance which Gunn has identified in late medieval farce. Indeed, Gunn claims that one must, quote, resituate farce within its original communicative settings, end quote, in order to access the deeper level of symbolic meaning contained in this vide around the script, the emptiness, the void to fill our performance. In these settings, Gunn identifies a, quote, subaltern resistance that can never be fully eradicated and retains its power precisely because it can be so difficult to detect, end quote. However, this is neither the impression of the genre which Rabelais' text gives, nor one which many in the French Renaissance economic or intellectual establishment would have actually sought to convey. It's unclear whether they would even be privy to this aspect of the performance, as the subaltern resistance was often hidden behind what Jelle Koopmans has called the rire grinçant, the cynical laugh of the common crowd. None of this changes the structure of farce itself. Someone is still guilty of démesure, and this does still inexorably lead to a volte-face, but it does change the genre's impact. By trapping farce in text and keeping it away from the largely illiterate common audience whose presence and perception traditionally constituted the locus of the genre's subversive power, farce in Rabelais is thus radically disarmed, no longer a vehicle for socio-culturally subversive content, but instead a paradigm in which those at the bottom of the socio-economic hierarchy must accept their position unquestioningly, with violent and degrading punishments if they do not. By removing the common audience from the equation, Rabelais leaves no room for even a raised eyebrow, let alone a cynical chuckle from the lower classes. Any subversive space is removed. So, turning back to the Dindenault episode then, as we seem to have strayed a little, the volte-face moment here is pretty obvious. The shepherd and his flock are drowned. But why? What did Dindenault do to deserve this? Now, answering this question will require us, like a bunch of Rabelaisian Ghostbusters, to cross the streams. We must integrate the economic and the theatrical approaches to the scene. So, while Rabelais was writing and living and working in Lyon, an elitist consumer culture, which originated in northern Italian markets of the mid-1400s, was spreading into and taking hold of the Lyonnese marketplace. By the middle of the 16th century, Italian merchants had established what amounted to a mercantile colony in Lyon, and their influence triggered an unprecedented expansion in the city's luxury local goods trade, transforming it from just a mere stop on a trans-European trade route to an important center of commerce in its own right. At this time, only those near the top of the socio-economic hierarchy really truly traded luxuries often, more than once every few years. And even then that was, you had to have some wealth. Well, yes, technically the Renaissance purchasing power ladder did extend from the bottom to the top of the socio-economic hierarchy, theoretically creating the potential for some form of trickle-down wealth. In practice, because of what Laura Martinez has called, quote, the structures of public finance that petted the wealthy and burdened the humble, end quote, it was nearly impossible for someone not already part of elite educated culture to enter it. Wealth accumulation was, and let's face it, still is, exclusionary, accompanied in the Renaissance, as Martinez explains, by, quote, soaring prices, stagnant wages, and recurrent famine, owing to which 65 to 80% of people worried chronically about the annual grain crop and the price of bread next winter, end quote. Dindenault is not part of the metropolitan elite, not even nearly. He's a lowly shepherd from rural northwestern France, likely part of that 65 to 80% who worried about bread prices. And yet, the price he quotes Panurge is astronomically high, 6 times higher than would be expected for a wool pelt from his region on the Lyonnese market at the time Rabelais was writing. Well, yes, by the middle of the 16th century, wool had risen in value in France, French wool, and yes, the most expensive pelts in the country were those from Noireau in the Santon region from which Dindenault hails. Their average value was 6 to 10 times less than the equal weight in silk, which was the real luxury textile over the same period. In this context, Dindenault's inflated price begins to look like an attempt to sell his pelts as though they were luxurious Italian silk, and his ruse is emphasized by his comparison of his sheep to moutons de Levant, as most Levantine silk imports, actually textile imports more broadly, came into Lyon via Italy. Still, hey, the value of these sheep is, according to Dindenault, derived from more than their wool. The shepherd breaks his sheep down into all their potentially profitable uses. Leather as good as Morocco, violin and as that of Morocco, violin and harp strings more melodious than those even of Munich or Aquila, meat fit for kings, fertile urine also suitable for alchemy and for use in medicine, and horns which when ground, sown and watered produce asparagus. Dindenault's polyvalent herd transcends the normal bounds of sheepishness, and the wonders of which they are capable come, according to him, from their mythological genealogy. He claims they are of the same stock from which Jason took the golden fleece. Their genealogy and their panoply of superlative and supernatural uses render these sheep both genetically and practically durable. In Dindenault's eyes and in his pricing, they become durable goods of enormous quality and luxury. Their high value is contained in their genealogy, their provenance, to borrow the term from rare art dealers. Dindenault, the peasant shepherd, thus seems to be trying to infiltrate the luxury goods market of 16th century France's wealthy elite, a market from which he would have been absolutely economically excluded. Dindenault's murder is thus a visceral representation and reinforcing of the economic structures of the period. The shepherd is being punished for trying to take part in a trade reserved for the rich. The extreme, often deadly poverty in which the vast majority lived during the early 16th century becomes the sea under which Dindenault is held. Panurge and the ore he uses to ensure Dindenault's demise embody the early modern economic systems which kept the wealthy rich and the poor in poverty. The rightful place to which the shepherd is returned is literally a struggle for survival at the hands of a representative of a higher social order, signaled by the cultivated rhetorical oration delivered by Panurge as he holds Dindenault underwater with his oar. Rabelais seems to be pushing a very elitist and conservative agenda here. His corruption of farce, particularly its dislocation from its original communicative settings, creates a space of impunity for Panurge in which he can silence Dindenault, the social climber, forever, embodying and acting out a symbolic representation of early modern economic oppression from the enclosed world of a theatrical stage at sea and away from the raised eyebrows or rire croissant of a common crowd. So in summary, the Dindenault episode stands at the intersection of two discourses, the economic and the farcical. By removing the farce paradigm from its original communicative settings, Rabelais, and more broadly, those who controlled what was printed and archived, has left no space for the subversive potential of farce, which requires performance before a common audience in order to be actualized. As a result, both Rabelais' dislocated farce paradigm and Renaissance elitist consumer culture carry with them broadly the same socio-economic message, one of the enduring dominance of those with money, power, and education. The way Rabelais uses farce to restate and reinforce socio-economic and socio-cultural hierarchies is surprisingly conservative for someone who is, in the eyes of so many, such a radically innovative writer. And it certainly undermines Hayes's claim that Rabelais and his elite humanist compatriots were the ones who ultimately, quote, recognized farce's potential to be transformed into a political weapon to be used against entrenched institutions, end quote. It kind of already was. It's certainly hard to reconcile this hegemony upholding Rabelais with the world upending one seen by Mikhail Bakhtin, for example. Perhaps this inconsistency will never be reconciled. Perhaps it was intentional, Rabelais' last great literary joke. Or perhaps the real innovation here was a radical conservatism, its innovative literary forms too divergent from the mainstream conservative discourses of Rabelais' time to be fully accepted. Ultimately, his conservative use and indeed abuse of farce has persisted precisely because, by coming packaged in the hollowed out shell of a commoner's genre, it has remained so difficult to detect. Thank you very much.